Hello, everybody. I went to the conference on campus this weekend, this Friday night, the Disruptors Conference, people who disrupt problems in the world and make solutions. You know, five or six really good people, including David Lynch and Father Gabriel Mejia from Colombia, who's taken 100,000 children off the streets and saved their lives. Made a huge difference, I'm sure, in the life of Colombia. And at the meeting last night, questions were offered to David Lynch. And one girl who was a student here at MUM was concerned about debt. And I'm just making this video as a means of promoting Austrian economics, or at least a, a kind of a sense that it's not really possible that the politics of this country will become anything other than destructive of life due to the nature of government. That it attracts people who are crooks, basically, and self-interest builds up, or what do you call it? Special interest builds up over the decades that a government exists. And those special interests are infused in society, and brainwash the entire population to thinking that we need government. It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous idea. In any case, this lady's concern about debt is very likely not to be necessary because the American economy, contrary to what the Fox News people have been saying, I mean, this is really bad, you know, that the Fox News people, I agree with a lot of what they say, but they have no idea. They're not separate at all from the collectivist economics that was developed in the 20th century, the Keynesian economics. And that says that economics says that spending and debt is a good thing for an economy, and it's absurd. It's absurd on the face of it. On the face of it. If you want to understand how an economy grows, it grows only by savings, and that the debt has to be based on savings. It can't come out of thin air, as is the case when you have a central bank like the Federal Reserve. And by the way, the fact that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, is not a government agency, but it's a quasi-government agency, it's neither here nor there. That's a lot of BS. That's a lot of populist crap, ignorance and thoughtlessness about the way the incentives that whether a government has or a agency which is completely connected to the government. I mean, after all, the Fed chairman's appointed by the president, and I mean, they're not independent. The whole argument that they shouldn't be audited because they're not independent is crazy, because they aren't independent. They're political as hell. And the whole society is political, and the whole educational system has created a belief in that political situation, which is, if you understand the debt and the debt created by, you know, Steve Forbes was, I remember once seeing him 10 years ago on TV saying that debt is not so bad because we had debt. That's how we built the Industrial Revolution, with debt. But that's debt based on savings. And the Austrian contribution is that savings, one of the Austrian contributions, is that savings is the foundation of proper borrowing. And you go decade after decade of improper borrowing through fiat currency, and you get bursts and bubbles. You get bursts, yeah, bubbles and I mean bubbles and bursts, booms and busts, and that's what we've had, and we had that during the previous century as well, before the Fed was created, but that was also caused by central banking, because in 1862 we created central banks. Lincoln created central banks, and the Republicans created central banks during the war, when the Confederacy wasn't there to neutralize it. The Democrats were wiped out in Washington at that time. So we've always had we had central banks from 1790 something to 1830 something. We had two central banks. So we've only had 25 years without central banking, and even then the governments interfered with the banking system. So there was a panic in 1857, but it was a very minor one, because there was very minor interference from government in the banking system. And basically the free market was protecting the society at the time. So what's the situation? The situation is we had a recession 8 years ago. All the banks went broke. The government bailed them out. Well, you're bailing out something that's wrong in the first place, and because you bailed out, you make it worse. In 2000, we had the dot-com bust, and Greenspan lowered interest rates to unprecedented low numbers, the head of the Federal Reserve at the time. And there was a housing boom that was created. And that was the first time in history that during a recession there was more borrowing than there than in not in a recession. So and then the dot-com bubble that was created in the 90s was also caused by super low interest rates, or fairly low interest rates. And the bailout of long-term capital management, a company that Greenspan bailed out, that's also not free enterprise. And when they bailed out the banks, that's also not free enterprise. So there's no free enterprise going on around here. This is a socialist country. There's some free enterprise, but there's a lot of socialism, especially in money, since 1913, especially since 1915, 16, when they changed the law so they could go to war, so that the Federal Reserve could create money out of thin air to pay the government and screw the people over out of the value of their currency, which is what they did. So there's no knowledge about what actually happened in the education that we get in this country. And there's no knowledge of economics, which is not a science like physics or chemistry. It's a science like, or biology, or psychology. It's a science like mathematics. It's an a priori science. And so the laws of economics are impossible to deny. They're logically self-consistent. I mean, some of the laws derive from the laws actually have empirical axioms behind them, but it's mostly an a priori situation, namely the law of marginal utility, that the additional item of a homogeneous good is valued less. And that's the law of marginal utility, and that's basically the foundation of all of economics as a deductive system. So anyway, getting back to these self-evident, besides which all the principles should be self-evident. The whole point of savings, as our great-grandmothers used to say, is to prepare for the future. And that's not just for the individual, but that's for the society. The society prepares for the future through savings. But since the government has created low interest rates, nobody can afford to save, so they create bubbles in the stock market. There's an article in the Iowa Source for March by Hal Massover, which pretends that these growths that are going on in the stock market or in the housing market or in the bond market are actually a sign of strength, or that the unemployment is a sign of strength. The unemployment's not a sign of strength. The unemployment is due to the fact that people have to take multiple jobs because their wages aren't worth anything anymore. Because they're getting junk jobs instead of the old factory jobs. Like when my dad was working. In those days, you made lots of money. A working man made tons of money, and mom didn't have to go to work. And she stayed home with the kids. So, but in any case, you're piling on debt, and the world's getting sick of it. The world's been propping up the dollar. They propped up the dollar in '08. A lot of the people that did Austrian economics thought, like Ron Paul, thought that they wouldn't do that. And we thought the dollar would collapse at that time. But the world's propping up the dollar because their governments are also corrupt, because there's special interests in those countries that have contracts with American consumers, consumer companies like Walmart, and so they prop it up. Plus, they have this stupid economics of debt or of inflation, of stimulation, stimulating the economy through inflation, because the dollar is propped up by all the governments in the world that print money in their currency to prop up the dollar. Basically, that means that the world is giving America stuff. America is not a strong economy. These are idiots. These are people that went to college in America, and they learned nothing about economics. Matter of fact, if you got a degree in economics, you became ignorant in economics. You became stupid. You got brainwashed. Because you can't engineer society. Society is a bunch of people who engineer their own lives with the only competence that's possible. In the old days, during the days of the 1850s, when they had gold and silver, which is what all banknotes were backed up by. And the people wanted the gold and the silver. That was their own choice. Everything was free in those days. Nobody was bothering anybody. Although, government was even then creeping on, because there's two types of people in the world: those who mind their own business and those who try to mind other people's business. And this Federal Reserve's been there for 105 years, and it's making the country weaker and weaker. After this, as a matter of fact, I don't really understand why we even grew after the World War II, why the American economy grew. But it only grew for 30 years, and then it started stagnating. It grew a little bit in the 80s, but it stagnated again. And see, when you see the stock market growing under these circumstances, that's a bad thing. When you see lots of people getting jobs under these circumstances, that's a bad thing. And besides which, many people, millions of people are completely out of the job market, and those people are not counted. They used to be counted. And Trump said that when he was running. I'm not in favor of Trump here, but he said something which was true, that these are fake numbers. And Hal Massover in the Iowa Source, seems to think they're real. He's not, what the hell's the matter with him? I can't believe it. He's an educated man. So now you're piling on debt. You're piling on expenditures, trillions of dollars in expenditures, trillions of dollars in debt, trillions of dollars in unfunded liabilities, and the world is getting tired of propping up the dollar. That's what's the matter with the American economy, that it's based on debt and credit. It's not based on savings like our great-grandmothers used to tell us. In my case, it was my grandmother, but some of you, this girl that asked this question, David Lynch, is about a third my age. So it's a natural thing for people to save, to prepare for the future. And that savings is the basis. It means that when you went to work and you didn't spend all your income, and you put some in the bank, which is what people did in the old days before there was too much, the interest rates were too low because the Federal Reserve made them too low, then there was balance in the economy. And there was capacity for the economy to grow without booms and busts, although that's hardly been the case since the Fed was created. As it was kind of the case in the 1880s and 90s after we went on the gold standard in 79 and in the 1900s. But the controllers, the control freaks that want to treat human beings like they're marbles in a bowl, and they just follow, or billiard balls, and they follow the laws of physics. That's the way the intellectuals have been corrupted in this country, in this world. They don't understand that life is a bunch of universes which have to have respect for each other, because that's what we do when we are raised as babies and children. Our parents give us huge amounts of respect as individuals and they ask for our permission. They ask for our permission. It isn't that the main thing that parents do is ask for a permission. It isn't that they control us, and sure, they give us a safe environment, or a safe, based on our development, based on traditions, and based on instincts. But the amount of debt and the amount of weakness in our economy, we have an $800 billion trade deficit. That means we're not making anything. That's what that means. We're not making anything. I was coming back from Chicago yesterday, and I was looking at all these warehouses, Sears, Roebuck, and whoever, millions. It's a huge country, and there's huge amounts of consumerism. But there's no factories. There's no factories. There's no development of individuals. There's no free enterprise like there should be. There's more free enterprise in China. You'll have these people. You'll have these ignorant intellectuals saying that China's a controlled economy. No, this is the controlled economy right here. There's a lot of inertia of capital, and like I said, we are being given all the junk that we get from China, or all the stuff. I mean, it's not all junk. They're giving it to us by pegging their currencies to us and all the other countries in the world at that rate, right? Because they all buy the dollar. All the central banks buy the dollar, and we're not producing anything because this is an anti-business country. We have anti-business rhetoric. And the debt is huge, and the parameters of the economy are getting weaker and weaker. They're not getting stronger. This is nonsense. Everybody's got 3 jobs because they're cheap, junky little jobs at McDonald's or something. So don't worry about your debt, because what happens is, because it's all a bubble, because it's not based on real substantial savings and a free market, which we don't have because there's too damn much regulation and too damn much taxes. And I don't care if you don't like what I'm saying, because if you don't like to hear the truth, then you don't deserve to not be worried about your student loans. But your student loans are going to get wiped out if you keep borrowing them. In other words, you won't have to pay them. Creditors lose and debtors win when the currency is destroyed by the central banks. And that's what they're going to do. They've done it over and over throughout the 20th century and in the 21st century too. In Venezuela, they're doing it right now. The central bank is destroying their currency, and the people are starving. We're going into hell. So you might as well get a bunch of knowledge, and don't vote for anybody except people who want to shrink the government, because this tax cut is going to make it worse. Just look at David Stockman, who was Ronald Reagan's economist. I forget what they called it, Office of Management and Budget Director, for a couple of years, and then they fired him because he was telling the truth. Politicians don't want to hear the truth; they just want to get elected next time. And so Reagan was surrounded by politicians. And you have to have a free market in money, and a central bank is an evil thing. In the 80s, Paul Volcker actually saved the dollar by raising interest rates. See, but as long as you have low interest rates, nobody's going to save. the economy gets weaker and weaker, and the only reason that we don't have hyperinflation is because the world is propping the dollar up, but they're getting tired of that. And the more, and there's all the parameters are bad, see? And people aren't people aren't going to be buying U.S. Treasuries anymore. They're not doing it now. They're backing down on it. That's why they had QE during the Obama years. 3 times they had QE. They were buying. The Federal Reserve was printing up money out of thin air and buying Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, which is the 2 bubbles, right? And then there's the stock market. This time they're going to buy the stock market. They're going to buy Treasuries, and they're going to buy mortgage-backed securities, and they're going to destroy the currency. It's going to happen this year, if not the following winter. Most likely. I'd be very surprised because the country is so weak. Everybody's deluded by consumerism. You don't get rich by just stirring up, by creating cheap money. That cheap money becomes expensive after a while, and people want higher interest rates because they can see that the dollar is getting weaker. So they want higher interest rates. The Fed has a choice. They give them the higher interest rates, shut down the garbage economy, the fake economy that we have, like they should have done in '08 instead of bailing it out. Or in 2000, they should shut them down. Or back in the early '90s, or back in the '70s. We did some of that in the '70s. We did that in the '80s. We shut it down, let it purify. In those days, we had savings because the interest rates were high enough. People could afford to save, especially when Paul Volcker raised the hell out of the interest rates. But no. Now we keep the interest rates at 1.5%, right? The basis of all the other interest rates, the basic interest rate that the Fed creates. But that doesn't mean the market can't say, well, I want more money for my treasury bill. I want more return on my stocks. I want more return on my mortgage-backed security before I buy one. And what's the Federal Reserve going to do? Are they going to let interest rates go up so we can shut down the fakeness of the economy, the fake banks, the fake mortgage-backed securities, the fake educational system? It's fake. It's fake. This country is going to collapse. Trillions of dollars of loans that never should have been made. In the old days, you could get a job serving as a waiter in the summertime and pay for your education the whole year. But as soon as the government got involved, they drove the price through the roof. Everything should get cheaper in a free market. In a free society, everything gets cheaper. It doesn't get more expensive. But this is not a free society. This is a socialist society. It's increasingly a socialist society. And and Trump, he's not addressing that issue, even though he's half-assed addressing a few things. He's fixing the acne, but he's not doing anything for the bone marrow cancer. So don't worry about it. The Federal Reserve is going to destroy the currency. So that's why it's good to know how to do something real with your education. And to grow something, to make something, to start a business. But it's very hard to get capital when credit gets destroyed because the world finally realizes that this is a giant Ponzi scheme. The Social Security, the Treasury debt, the housing markets are all Ponzi schemes. And the world's going to say, hell, I'm not going to put any more money in that, And China is buying gold, and they're saying they got 1,000 ounces of gold, or 1,000 tons of gold, 1,000 tons of gold. They don't have 1,000; they got 5,000 or 7,000 tons of gold, because you can see how much is going into the coasts, and you can see how much they're shipping across the continent with military escorts, and you can see how much they're mining, and you can add it up. They don't know how much of that is taken up by the individuals in China and how much is taken up by the government. But it's a lot more than 1,000 tons. And they don't want the world to know that because they don't want to know that the world is sick of currencies. So that because they're holding all these currencies, they have trillions of dollars worth of dollars, right? trillions of dollars, right? And they don't want the world to know that. Japan's in the same boat, everybody else. So uh, this is a fake economy. This is all nonsense. Everybody knows that you have to have two or three jobs to survive. In the old days, mom didn't have to work. My mom didn't have to work. We had money, had extra money, and I mean, I suppose some people did, but in the old days, there was not a totally free market. But then it started getting really bad in the '60s. And of course, it was getting real bad in the '30s too, with the Roosevelt activities. And then the war, of course, was created by Wilson because World War I created World War II. So um, that's what's going to happen. The Federal Reserve isn't going to let everything collapse because bubbles always collapse because there's nothing supporting them. There's no substance behind them. The stock market's going to collapse. The housing bubble's going to collapse. The banks are going to go broke again. Nobody's going to buy treasuries because there's no return on them, especially as the currency gets weaker. The government made up a new way of measuring inflation, price inflation. It's a nonsense thing. They left out energy and food. It's a nonsense thing. And then they put in ebonics, saying that you get more out of the thing and therefore prices have gone down. All you have to do is go out and live, you know the reality. So this girl that was worried, and David Lynch said something funny. He said, "Oh, you should just buy lottery tickets." No, you just get the damn loans and let them get wiped out because they're going to get wiped out because the Federal Reserve is going to destroy the currency. This is a Mickey Mouse country. Don't think of anything else. It's a Mickey Mouse country, and it's full of lies. It's been lying to us for from the beginning. It's been full of liars. About 2/3 of them are liars, and so that's why you don't have to worry about your debt. Just borrow everything you can, and let the creditors pay for it. And by the way, it's going to stop the wars. When the thing collapses, when the currency collapses, when the budget collapses, it's not good. This is not a good situation. I mean, just because I'm here and I'm in the dome creating coherence, we don't have the numbers to create coherence sufficiently to have any sense at all in the federal government policy. And the right and the left, they're both dumb as hell. They don't know anything. Got a guy like David Stockman. He's an Austrian. He understands economics. Got a guy like Ron Paul. In 2001, he predicted the banking crash of 2008. Said they're going to crash when they pass the housing bubble, when they pass the Dodd-Frank Housing Act to subsidize, to force the money into housing, and to force it legally even, not just by low interest rates. So all these bubbles are created by artificial interest rates that have nothing to do with savings, and they discourage savings. And it's getting worse and worse. And there's no way it's going to keep going. There's no way. It can't just keep going forever. This mediocrity and this junk existence that we have. The world is not made by government. Government doesn't do anything for life. That's nonsense. I'm trying to convince people on Facebook to see if they have any sense. But they're brainwashed. Everybody's brainwashed. They say, oh, who's going to build the roads? You know who's going to build the roads? Somebody who wants to make some money is going to build the roads. Somebody who's going to do it for a profit. To say that you have to have the roads is to say that you can engineer society. And you can't engineer society. You don't know what it is. Society is the people, each person having his own universe. And so we respect the individual. We ask for his feelings and permission and his thoughts. And we don't proceed as if he's an object without any ability to judge his own happiness. That's what we keep saying. That's what these demagogues are telling you all the time that you went to school in. And you got here at MUM, and you started getting the idea of your own consciousness and your own self-sufficiency. But then you got you got Mayor Malloy, who's basically a dictator. That's what government is. It tells you how to live. You know, and he's supposed to be celebrated. He's on the board of trustees. So what? I mean, he's a dictator. You make your own roads, you make your own education through cooperation or through individuality or whatever. But it's voluntary. That's the distinction. And they're just about to collapse. The thing is just about to collapse because it always does. Theft always ends up with collapse. Ponzi schemes, con jobs always end up with collapse. In this case, it's because of artificial low interest rates over the decades and inflation that comes out of it, you know, the fractional reserve banking system. It has to collapse. And they have two choices. The Federal Reserve has two choices. Let it collapse, which is the right thing to do, which they should have done in 08 or 2000 or on back. They did the right thing in the 80s, but then they spent too much, see? Because Reagan couldn't get his defense budget without social spending from the Democrats, for the Democrats. And then in the 70s, we had war and welfare. We invented it in the 65. Lyndon Johnson invented it in the 60s. So he invented big welfare programs, which are not a good thing. They're not a good thing because they destroy the family. They destroy progress. They destroy growth. The poverty rate was going down much faster. As soon as they created the war on poverty rate leveled off. It didn't go down anymore. It was going like hell. It's going down and down. Just look at Thomas Sowell, the black economist. He's written dozens of books, all of them loaded with intelligence and facts, history. So don't worry about your debt. Borrow and get enlightened and live a life of love and happiness. Don't worry about this propaganda, you know. And in this case, debt is, and in fact, when you and I borrowed money from the government or from private, in my days it was from private banks who were regulated by the government, it's about the same thing. We're stealing. We're part of the system of theft. But since you're here and this is the highest knowledge in the world, let the people give it to you. Let the people subsidize this knowledge and be happy. But don't worry about your debt because it's going to collapse.